Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 374. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I have a lot to cover on today's show, including an article from myself and Will Porter about the fate of a lot of the foreign fighters that entered Ukraine. So a lot of important stuff to cover on today's show. Just want to remind people that it's the fundraiser at antiwar.com. And so if you want to head on over there and help out, I'm the opinion editor there. A lot of what I write ends up on antiwar.com. We repost this show in the blog section. And right now, this week, we have $25,000 in matching funds. And so if y'all made donations, that will be doubled. Really appreciate if you could donate, especially this week. And if you can't, just think about sharing the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. All right, let's get into the stories today. The first article is the one I mentioned from myself and Will Porter. Hundreds of foreign fighters killed in Ukraine, thousands still in combat. Thousands of people from around the world have answered Ukraine's call to arms and have traveled to the country to fight, with around 100 foreign nationals killed on the battlefield over the last year, in addition to more than 1,000 wounded, the Washington Post reports. In a series of interviews with foreign volunteers, the Post highlighted a range of different motivations driving the fighters. While some had found a new sense of purpose in Ukraine's cause, others seemed more interested in posing for Instagram than committing to the drudgery of trench warfare, or were too eager to live out fantasies from Call of Duty video game. A smaller number have faced more serious allegations of theft or sexual assault, or were fleeing trouble in their homeland and ended up in Ukraine that way. And one that's up. There's a part of me that is doing this for the right reasons, and there's a part of me that is doing this for the violence. It's kind of a bit of both, a British fighter told the outlet. And so one of the reasons I thought this story was particularly important is because it's in the Washington Post. Now, you know, everybody who listens to this show and, reads antiwar.com has known all along that there are a lot of very nefarious elements within Ukraine's own military, particularly their National Guard and the Azov Regiment, Battalion, whatever they want to call themselves now, as a lot of those are ultra ethnic nationalists for Ukraine. They, are neo-Nazis. They, have a lot of those ideas and propaganda and use violence and have, committed crimes against civilians, because of their, ethnic ideology. And we also know that there's a lot of people from around the world that has traveled to Ukraine, based on these same Nazi ideas to fight for the Ukrainian forces. And at the same time, it's been presented in the West as this is the most noble cause ever to fight for. Everybody in Ukraine is a freedom fighter. They're just doing everything they can to defend their homelands, and they have no nefarious motives whatsoever. And for that reason, we have to give them our blanket support. And here, we're having these, I think, important cracks and important truths come out even in the mainstream media. And so to make sure that, we could say, well, the Washington Post even admit that the reasons that these people are fighting in Ukraine aren't so, noble is really important. So back to our article. In the early months of the war, Kiev claimed tens of thousands of people had signed up to fight along Ukrainian forces, even creating a special website to draw in potential recruits. However, the Post noted that many fighters were deterred early on, as the realities of war unnerved many initial volunteers, citing unnamed analysts and academics. The outlet estimate that there are currently between 1,000 and 3,000 foreign fighters in Ukraine. Now, I am interested to know if, when they count this, if there are maybe exceptions for Georgian or fighters from neighboring countries, or if this really means that they think that there's only 3,000 total. We get a little bit different numbers here from Moscow. Moscow has offered its own figures for the number of foreign nationals on the battlefield, with the defense ministry claiming that nearly 7,000 people had rushed to join Ukraine's international legion between February and June of 2020. Of those, around 2,000 had been killed and another 1,800 800 had left those countries. Those stats remain unconfirmed. So that would put the Russian number slightly higher than the Ukrainian number. Some fighters spoke of being sent on suicide missions by their Ukrainian commanders, with one unnamed Canadian volunteer saying a fellow countryman was killed during such an operation. The military vet spoke on condition of anonymity due to fear of retribution by the Ukrainian government, and went on to express frustration that the Ukrainian forces were not better prepared. And this is something that I was concerned about, especially in the early days of the war, as Kiev was trying to rally other countries to get more involved in its military campaign, is if Americans, if Brits, if Poles, etc., are dying, by numbers that are hard to ignore back home. So, you have 50 dead Americans, 20 dead Brits, something like this. It's going to be major, stories in these countries for, multiple weeks on end, likely. And I was concerned that Ukraine would want to basically throw these people into the front of the meat grinder in order to, use their deaths to drive more sympathy to their cause. So it seems that we have some of, that confirmed. According to Kasper Riawick, a researcher at the Center for Research on Extremism, at least 100 foreign fighters have been killed in Ukraine and over 1,000 have been wounded. In March, the Post reported that thousands of fighters had already arrived in the country, warning that many had held a shared vision for an ultra-nationalist ethno-state. Ukraine's International Legion is now facing a major scandal surrounding its spokeswoman, Eminise Fak, who allegedly committed fraud in Australia before fleeing to Ukraine, is currently under investigation by Kiev's intelligence agency for stealing millions of dollars in medical supplies intended for foreign fighters, according to the Daily Mail. Though Frock denies these allegations, the stolen aid was said to include large quantities of painkillers like fentanyl, lidocaine, ketamine, along with more common medications. So, I think this is a little bit aside from the Washington Post story. It's reported in the Daily Mail, which has been more critical of Kiev. But we do have this narrative that's portrayed by much of the U.S. foreign policy establishment that all the money going to Ukraine is going to good causes, and like Angus Kane said, every tax dollar is being well spent. This is more evidence that that is not the case. Now, maybe the most serious story that we have to talk about today is this from Dave DeCamp. New York Times, U.S. considering helping Ukraine strike Crimea. The New York Times reported on Wednesday that the U.S. is warming to the idea of helping Ukraine strike Crimea, something the Biden administration has previously avoided due to the risk of provoking a major response from Russian President Vladimir Putin. Citing unnamed U.S. officials, the report said that after months of discussion with Ukrainian officials, the administration is now starting to concede that Kiev may need the power to strike Russian sanctuary, even if such a move increases the risk of escalation. President Biden is holding off sending longer-range missiles that could hit targets in Crimea that Ukraine is seeking because the U.S. is discussing with Ukrainian officials how to attack the land bridge to Crimea Russia has secured for itself using U.S.-provided weapons, such as U.S.-provided HIMARS rocket systems and Bradley fighting vehicles. The U.S. for the first time pledged to send 50 Bradleys in an over $3 billion package that was announced earlier this month. The Bradleys could potentially help Ukraine go on the offensive, and U.S. officials said HIMARS could be used to hit Russian supply lines coming out of Crimea from lines in Kherson. A senior U.S. official told the Times that the U.S. and Ukrainian officials are set to meet in Germany this week to wargame out a potential offensive against Russia in southern Ukraine. But the report said that even with the additional military aid, the Biden administration doesn't think Ukraine can actually take Crimea from Russia. So this was maybe the one little piece of reason that I've seen here is that they want to use this to pressure Russia. They don't actually plan on conquering this territory. So I'm I'm glad that there's not like an explicit or even seemingly an implicit now green light for the Zelensky plan to retake all of Ukrainian territory, and there maybe still is some acknowledgement in the White House that overall the Ukraine is going to have to cede some of its territory to Russia. So the U.S. thinking is that Crimea needs to be under threat to give Ukraine leverage for any future negotiations, even though the risk of escalation is extremely high. U.S. official says there have been dampening of fears that targeting Crimea would drive Mr. Putin to use a tactical nuclear weapon. The lessening concern about Putin's resorting to nukes appears to be based only on the fact that he hasn't used it up to this point. This reflects a December report from the Times of London that said the Pentagon was tacitly backing Ukrainian attacks inside Russia because Putin didn't respond to earlier attacks with a tactical nuclear weapon or by attacking NATO territory. The New York Times report quoted David Mascott, a researcher from the RAND Corporation, who claimed that Crimea has already been hit multiple times without massive escalation from the Kremlin. But his claims is false because Russia began launching missile strikes on vital Ukrainian infrastructure in response to the October truck bombing of the Crimean bridge. Before the bridge bombing, Russia didn't launch large-scale attacks on infrastructure in Ukraine, but now such bombardments have become routine and millions of Ukrainians are struggling to power and heat their homes. U.S. officials admit they don't know how Putin would respond to the U.S. supporting Ukrainian attacks on Crimea. Putin has previously warned he could use nuclear weapons to protect Russia's territorial integrity, and Russia's military doctrine allows for the use of nuclear weapons if the country faces an existential threat. And Crimea, I think, is a pretty core concern of Russia, as we saw in 2014. Next up, U.S. allies preparing to ramp up military aid to Ukraine. The U.S. and its allies are holding a series of meetings this week in Europe where new pledges for military aid to Ukraine are expected to be made, and more countries might agree to arm Kiev with tanks. This is something I've been speculating about for 2 or 3 weeks now on the show, that this was likely to happen as after Poland got the okay, even like a backdoor okay, an unofficial okay from Germany to send those the Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, it became pretty clear that other countries were going to send tanks. We now know that the UK is going to send their Challenger 2 tanks, and I think it's only a matter of time before the US starts sending Abrams, although I think the US, sending the tanks, there may be some more logistical challenges to gain such heavy equipment to Ukraine rather than a country like Poland. Although the U.S. may have some of these tanks in Europe that it could send to Ukraine and then, send different tanks to Europe over a longer time span or something like that. Next up, at Davos, Zelensky tells Western backers to speed up arms deliveries. And so this is, as Zelensky gets to give another address, he does this everywhere, every U.S. award show and things like this guy's there. It happens in the international space too. And probably more importantly, it happens at gatherings of what, are considered the world leaders, like the World Economic Forum. And so these are all the people who actually, even if they shouldn't be in the position to make the decisions for the rest of us, are in the position to make the decisions for the rest of us. And they get, are told to sit down and listen to what Zelensky has to say. So in the video address to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Ukrainian President Zelensky told Kiev's Western backers to pick up the speed of their decisions on arms deliveries and veiled reference to Germany's hesitancy to send heavy tanks to the country. The list calls for decisive, effective joint actions, needs to be expanded with more. The call for speed, the call for the speed of decision making, Zelensky said. And, there's probably a little bit of reason to sympathize with the Ukrainians here because, they're fighting and dying in this war to weaken Russia for NATO. And at the same time, rather than being given a clear strategy to pursue with a clear indication of what weapons they will receive, what weapons they receive is largely dependent on the political situation in all these other countries. So apparently, criticizing the West's initial reaction to the war, Zelensky said Russia needs needed less than 1 second to start the war, and the world needed days to react with the first sanctions. Although the U.S. had plenty of sanctions on Russia before the invasion, and sanctions would never stop the invasion, the Ukrainian leader said the supply of air defense systems must outpace Russia's next missile attacks. The supply of Western tanks must outpace another invasion of Russian tanks. So yeah, and as we've been talking about on the show, there is more and more, commitment now. We have some commitment to send, I think it's about 24, 25 of these the German Leopard 2 tanks, but from Poland, not from Germany, and then the British Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine. I think Ukraine has asked for about 300 tanks. The issue of tank deliveries is expected to be a major topic of discussion this week during NATO's meeting in Brussels and a gathering of the Ukrainian Defense Contract Group at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany, which is chaired by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. While entirely relying on the U.S. and its allies for the war effort, Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials are not afraid to criticize their Western backers. Ukraine's foreign minister said earlier this month, no one has done enough to support Ukraine. In his World Economic Forum address, Zelensky accused some Western countries of taking for granted the values that Ukraine is fighting for. We routinely defend values some of allies take for granted as a fact of life, and I don't know what values those are. Maybe banning his political opposition or nationalizing the country's media. Next up, NATO chief calls for a significant increase in military aid to Ukraine. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg on Wednesday called for a significant increase in the military aid for Kiev. This is a pivotal moment in the war and the need for a significant increase in support for Ukraine, the NATO chief told Reuters on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Stoltenberg claimed that the more weapons to Ukraine would make a negotiated solution more likely. If we want to negotiate a peaceful solution, we need to provide more weapons today, he said. And this is just like kind of the backwards Orwellian thinking that exists through most of the NATO mindset. And Stoltenberg has been a pretty just mouthpiece for Ukraine, always asking for more. And, the only path to diplomacy, he claims, is through, waging this war to a greater and greater degree. Stoltenberg made similar claims a few weeks ago when he said the quickest possible path to peace is through pouring more weapons into Ukraine, but said things stand, there is no indication peace talks will happen soon, and Western support emboldens Ukraine to make unrealistic demands, such as calling for war tribunals for Russia before negotiations can even begin. For their part, Russia maintains that any negotiated solution must recognize the territory it has annexed as a part of the Russian Federation. With the two sides so far apart, there is no end to the fighting in sight. The NATO chief's latest comments came ahead of a meeting of the Ukrainian Defense Contact Group, and we've already mentioned that on the show. Next up, we have a story about our highest-ranking military official, General Mark Milley, and he is going to meet a top Ukrainian commander in Poland. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, on Tuesday met with the commander of Ukrainian armed forces at an undisclosed location in Poland near the Ukrainian border. The highly symbolic meeting marked the first time the two military leaders held in-person talks. Colonel David Butler, a U.S. military spokesperson, told the Washington Post Milley and the Ukrainian general spent a few hours together. The meeting was arranged after it became clear that the Ukrainian general would not be able to attend the meeting, NATO meeting in Brussels that's scheduled for Wednesday. Milley made the trip after visiting Ukrainian troops in Germany as they started a new expanded U.S. training program, another symbolic trip by the highest ranking U.S. military officer. Excuse me. All right, couple more stories here. Zelensky advisor resigns after comments on Dnipro strike caused backlash. And so this was about the apartment building that was hit. You have scores of people dead. It looks like a Russian missile hit the building, but it was a Ukrainian air defense missile that likely intercepted the missile. And as I said on the show, that doesn't make it the Ukrainians' fault that this building was hit. It's still the Russians' fault. But there's a huge difference between Russia intentionally targeting a apartment building and through warfare, a Russian missile, the Russians are the aggressors here, but still, a Russian missile happening to hit this apartment building after it was, altered its course by a Ukrainian missile. Now, the reason I want to bring up the advisor resigning, because he's the one that initially brought up this possibility, is just to remember how tightly controlled information is in Ukraine. And when anybody steps out of line at all, that they end up having to give up their post. Next up, from Dave DeCamp here, Kissinger changes position, says Ukraine should join NATO. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said in a video address to the World Economic Forum on Tuesday that Ukraine joining NATO would be an appropriate outcome of the war, reversing his previous position that Kiev shouldn't join the Western military alliance. Before this war, I was opposed to membership of Ukraine in NATO because I feared it would start exactly the process that we have seen now, Kissinger said. Now that this process has reached this level, the idea of neutral Ukraine under these conditions is no longer meaningful. Kissinger's comments reflected an article he wrote for The Spectator last month. In that piece, he didn't explicitly say Ukraine should join NATO, but argued that a peace process should link Ukraine to NATO, however expressed. In the Spectator article, Kissinger called for negotiations to avoid another world war and suggested referendums could be held to settle disputes over some territory Russia has captured from Ukraine, but his opinion on the matter appears to have now changed. One of the reasons I think this is important and significant is, we, the dissenters to the Ukraine war, don't have a voice at all. Washington. Kissinger does. He has influence in Washington, and he seemed to be one of the few people who held a more reasonable view on this war, and now he has taken some steps in the opposite direction. So, this probably reflects the consensus in Washington, the Overton window in Washington, shifting further and further towards arming Ukraine with more and more weapons. Pentagon says U.S. artillery shells stored in Israel and South Korea are going to Ukraine. The U.S. has dipped into stockpiles of arms it keeps in Israel and South Korea to supply Ukraine with more artillery shells, the New York Times reported on Tuesday, citing anonymous U.S. and Israeli officials. The stockpile in Israel is meant to supply the U.S. for conflicts in the Middle East and is also used occasionally by Israel. Between the two stockpiles, the U.S. has shipped hundreds of thousands of artillery shells to Ukraine, as Kiev's war effort is entirely reliant on flows of U.S. ammunition. Israel hasn't shipped weapons of its own to Ukraine and initially was concerned about the U.S. drawing from the stockpiles to arm Kiev, but U.S. and Israeli officials told the Times about half of the 300,000 shells bound for Ukraine have already been shipped to Europe and will enter Ukraine through Poland. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, the U.S. has pledged to send Ukraine over 1,155 millimeter artillery shells. A senior U.S. official told the Times that a good portion of that number, although less than half, is being shipped from stockpiles in Israel and South Korea. The revelation demonstrates how supporting the war in Ukraine is depleting U.S. military stockpiles. U.S. weapons makers and the Army have big plans to ramp up ammunition production, but some military leaders are warning that it may be hard to arm both Ukraine and the U.S. as the war drags on. Ukraine is using an average of 90,000 artillery rounds each month, which is more than double what the U.S. and Europe can produce, signaling that a policy of supporting Kiev's war effort may be unsustainable. So one of the really complicated things with the war in Ukraine is Turkey, because the U.S. has found itself on the opposite side of conflicts as Turkey in multiple places in the world, but particularly in Syria, which is a core interest of Ankara. And now the war in Ukraine, Turkey, I've praised Turkey for doing this, has looked to, engage in negotiations and balance the relationship rather than like the rest of NATO just completely taking the side of Kiev. So Turkey is seeking U.S. warplanes after they agreed to buy Russian S-400 air defense systems under, I think, that deal probably starting the Obama administration, but during the Trump administration, we kicked Turkey out of the F-35 program because they were buying those munitions. Now, Turkey is seeking a new stockpile of F-16s, and there are some members of Congress dissenting, and we had the Turkish foreign minister telling U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken the U.S. should approve $20 billion in F-16s for Turkey. And this was said on Wednesday. As we stand together, this is not only for Turkey, but is also important for NATO and for the United States as well, the Turkish foreign minister said. We expect the approval in line with our joint strategic interests. According to the Turkish broadcaster TRT World, the foreign minister also told Blinken to convey to Congress that the F-16 deal shouldn't be linked to Sweden and Finland's NATO bid, which Ankara has yet to approve, and I think has signaled recently that they're not going to even bother with that until this summer. Now, last up today, one more article here, this one on Yemen. Saudi airstrikes killed at least 155 Yemeni civilians in 2022. According to numbers compiled by the Yemen Data Project, the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition killed at least 155 Yemeni civilians in 2022, despite the ceasefire that took place in April of that year. Another 316 Yemeni civilians were injured in airstrikes, which took place for the first time in 3 months, which all took place in the first 3 months of the year. The Saudis significantly ramped up their bombing campaign in January 2022, making it the most violent month for Yemeni civilians since the worst since 2016. Most of the civilian deaths took place when the Saudi coalition bombed a migrant detention facility in Sadr, killing at least 91 civilians and injuring 236 more. The Yemen Data Project recorded 3 individual airstrikes in this incident. No Saudi airstrikes have been recorded in Yemen since March 31st, but despite the ceasefire, 2022 saw the highest civilian casualty rates in the Saudi air war since 2019, demonstrating how significant surges in bombing during those 3 months. The surge came after the UN Human Rights Council voted to shut down an investigation into war crimes in Yemen. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. I think I'm only going to end up having 2 shows this week. I'm hoping to get back on the 3-show-a-week schedule next week. Moving across the country has surprisingly been a little bit more time consuming than I thought. So I didn't get that 3rd show out this week. But anyways, I hope you all are enjoying. Share the show. Check out the fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute if you can. And I'll catch you all next week.